For 7 long months, they'd been staring out to sea, watching and waiting. They knew the Allies were coming, knew that the British, Americans, Canadians were preparing a massive army that was coming to attack them, the hated German occupiers. But they didn't know when the Allies were coming, and they didn't know where they would land. And there's one other thing those Germans didn't know, that while they were watching the sea, others were watching them. Three in the morning in the English Channel, Tuesday the 6th of June, and the sea's so rough that every vessel in the 7,000-strong Allied Armada is being tossed and pitched through the waves. On landing craft 503, Commander Cliff Morris and his comrades are feeling terrible, thumping headaches, and most have been seasick. Cliff reaches for his diary and scrawls a note. We began to wish we were dead. They'd been trained to storm bunkers, assault beaches, kill Germans. But they'd never been trained for seas as rough as this. All of them were wondering the same thing. How the hell were they going to fight their way ashore when they felt so ill? Their only hope was that the Allies' airborne troops, dropped into France just a few hours earlier, would have taken out the German coastal defences. If not, they were in trouble. On the night of the 5th of June, this was the home of a young schoolteacher called Marcel Hamel. She couldn't sleep that night. Bombers kept passing overhead, roaring overhead. There was a full moon, light pouring through her window. When she looked outside, she saw an extraordinary sight. Parachutes were coming down all around her home. Fantastic shadows appearing from nowhere, she would later write in her diary, like huge black parasols which seemed to rain softly down on the fields opposite and disappear behind the back line of the hedgerow. Suddenly, she's wide awake, sits up in bed. Something's happening, she's sure of it. She throws on some clothes and rushes downstairs. Father Dumont has come outside too. He points to the material of a parachute hanging from the roof. Marcel Hamel has to pinch herself, and pinch herself again. Marcel went outside and was amazed to see an American paratrooper seated by a neighbour's gate. In a whisper, he tells me in impeccable French the astounding news. It's the Great Invasion. Thousands and thousands of paratroopers are descending here tonight. What that American paratrooper told Marcel Hamel was true. 13,000 American airborne troops were landing that night, and for many of them, their goal was the nearby town of Sainte-Mère-Église. And he said in English so no one else would understand, "Thank you, miss. The next days are going to be terrible. I'll think of you all my life." Inside the town itself, the local mayor, Alexandre Renaud, could scarcely believe his eyes when he saw paratroopers descending. He'd been awaiting this moment for years. The sight of the American paratroopers terrified the German garrison troops in Sainte-Mère-Église. Rudi Ischer, a 22-year-old conscript, had no intention of fighting. He and his platoon ran to get their bicycles, and then they fled the town. The German defences were left seriously weakened, but the soldiers who remained behind were tough, heavily armed, and determined to fight. The capture of Sainte-Mère-Église was one of the key American objectives on the night of the 5th of June. Behind me, you've got the road to Cherbourg. In front of me, you have the troops landing on Utah Beach. It was vital that they captured this town. The problem was that many of the paratroopers had been landed all over the place, scattered widely across the countryside. And so they had to form themselves into impromptu bands and start fighting their way into the town. One of the key characters that night was Colonel Edward Cannonball Krauss, who'd gathered together a band of men. He'd always promised that he'd be the first into the town, sitting in the town hall in the morning with the stars and stripes flying over the mairie of the town hall. And sure enough, that night, he fought his way in. He was indeed sitting in the town hall in the morning of the 6th of June. I've come to the US Airborne Museum in St Mary Église to speak with Magali Mallet about exactly what happened here on the 6th of June 1944.
It's the reason why General Eisenhower decided to have parachute landings on the east side of Overlord, that is to say for the British, at Pegasus Bridge, on the west side with here Sainte-Marie-Église, Sainte-Marie-du-Mont and Carentan. And the objective is to make sure that the landing on Utah Beach will be a success. Because the main objective of all of that is to gain control over the port of Cherbourg as quick as possible.
But Cannonball Krauss faced an uphill task. His men bailed out of their planes okay, but landing in darkness proved a nightmare. Many men landed miles off target. Some drowned in the flooded meadows. Others had broken legs and arms. Men who'd been sitting next to each other in a plane just minutes before now found themselves scattered over many miles of open countryside. Krauss was a professional though, and he trained his men to be professional. Not all their comrades had survived the jump. As they fought their way through the streets, they saw a macabre spectacle in the center of town. Dead American paratroopers swinging from trees and branches. From the spire of the church swung one who was still alive. It was several more hours before Private John Steele was eventually rescued. It was not long before the Stars and Stripes was flying over the mayor's office. Krauss then radioed a message to headquarters. "I have secured St Mary Église." This was true enough, but he'd only managed to do so thanks to the bravery of his men. Not for the first time, and nor for the last. The young men who did so much of the fighting got so little of the credit. Over the hours that followed, it became apparent that the paratrooper landings had been both a triumph and a disaster. A disaster because men had been scattered over a huge area of countryside. A triumph because they'd left the Germans totally confused. What on earth were the Americans trying to achieve? German commanders couldn't work out why they'd landed over such a wide area, not realizing it was a mistake. The real heroes of that night were the scattered groups of men who banded together and started to fight. Among them was Lieutenant Colonel Malcolm Brannan and his comrades. Like so many American paratroopers in the early hours of the 6th of June, Malcolm Brannan landed here in Normandy. He was completely lost, didn't know where he was, he'd lost all his comrades. But over the hour or so that followed, he gathered together a small band of men, and they came to this building here, knocked on this door here, to find out where they were. As they did that, they heard the roar of an engine and the sight of headlamps coming towards them. They figured this had to be some sort of German staff officer. They set up an ambush here at the sides of the road, and as the car came sweeping past, they turned their guns on it, and the car smashed into this wall here. In doing so, they discovered that they killed the first German general to be killed on D-Day, General Wilhelm Falle.
General Falle, who was the commander of the German division, so it was very helpful because for the Germans they were quite disorganized without the General Falle, of course, so it was good for them. Yeah. And I think that what was helpful too, it was what we call Operation Titanic. That is to say, they landed fake paratroopers on the north of France or here on the west, maybe 60 kilometers from here. So it was also helpful because the German and especially the High Command of the German forces were very, very focused on landing on the north of Europe and not in Normandy.
General Wilhelm Falle was one of many senior generals absent from their posts that night. The weatherman had assured them there was no chance of an Allied landing that night, so they'd all headed to Rennes for a war games practice. When news of the Allied parachute landings came through, the generals were horrified and dashed back to the coast. Among them was the soon-to-be-killed General Falle. Field Marshal Rommel was much further away. He'd gone back to Germany for his wife's birthday. It would be another few hours before he received a phone call from Hans Spiedel, his chief of staff. When he heard the news, he was stunned, horrified. "I'm returning," he snapped, "as fast as I can." But he already knew he'd made a terrible, disastrous mistake. One of the greatest challenges facing the planners of D-Day was how to breach Hitler's Atlantic Wall, the vast systems of fortifications that lined the Normandy coastline. So what did they do? They came here to Morfa in West Wales, and they built a replica 100 feet in length on the beach and decided to work out how best to breach it. They got an armoured vehicle and they equipped it with what was called the GOAT, 1,600 pounds of high explosive, which attached itself to the concrete as the armoured vehicle retreated, and it was then detonated by remote control. There was a massive explosion, and when the dust settled, they realised they'd pierced a huge hole in this concrete wall, that Hitler's Atlantic Wall was not impregnable, and it could indeed be breached. The great challenge of D-Day was that men would be coming ashore on completely exposed beaches and under withering German machine gun fire. The Allied planners knew this, and so they called upon the services of a creative genius called Sir Percy Hobart. Sir Percy was asked to go away and think about what machines, what vehicles could be brought ashore to give those men some armoured support. He came back with this genius design, the amphibious tank, the DD tank it was known as, or the men called it the Donald Duck tank. It was designed to swim into the beaches, to land just before the infantrymen, and thereby provide big gun support for the men who were to storm the beaches. Sir Percy came up with a number of other things as well. The crab was one of his inventions. It was a flail tank that would flail the beach and get rid of any landmines that had been placed there by the Germans. And he also invented the bobbin, a giant machine that would lay a steel carpet onto soft sand so that heavy machinery could be brought ashore. All of these machines were vitally important for the infantry landing on these beaches, which are so exposed. D-Day, 5:30 in the morning. The young German conscript Franz Gockel is crouched in his machine gun nest overlooking Omaha Beach. He stares at the sea, nothing but waves and mist. But as that early morning mist begins to lift, he can see some sort of shadow on the horizon. He reaches for his binoculars, blinks and gasps. There's a massive, vast armada on the horizon, and it's coming towards him. This then was it. After months of waiting, this was Invasionstag. This was D-Day. Attackers and defenders were united in fear that morning. Fear of the unknown, fear of the beach, fear of death. 2 miles offshore from Omaha Beach, tossing around in the waves, are 6 landing craft. The advance guard due to land in the first wave. 31 lads in each craft, 31 conscripts putting a brave face on what was to come. They've been nicknamed the Suicide Wave, as they'll be the first men on the beach. They see it as a badge of honour. Their leader was Captain Taylor Fellers, a clean-shaven construction worker in civilian life. Many of his lads came from the same town, Bedford, Virginia, old friends and good friends. Their task that morning was to capture one of the 4 ravines that led up the steep bluffs behind Omaha Beach. It provided vital access to the town of Verville-sur-Mer. It would have been a tall order for professional soldiers, even more so for young conscripts. The planners of D-Day knew the dangers of landing infantry on exposed beaches. Their solution was to send in amphibious tanks before the infantry, tanks that could silence the German guns. But those tanks had been built for calm seas, and the seas were anything but calm that morning. Many of the tanks sank. Those that didn't were slowed by the waves. When Taylor Fellers and his men approached the shore, they found themselves alone. There was no armoured support whatsoever. All along Omaha Beach, the Germans were watching. At the western end of the beach, in Strongpoint 72, a teenage conscript named Carl Wegner was nervously waiting the arrival of Taylor Fellers and his men. The landing craft got closer and closer. Soon they were in the shallows. The front of the boat dropped down, and Captain Taylor Fellers and his men were splashing through the water, advancing towards Strongpoint 72, advancing towards Carl Wegner. "Fire! Fire!" Wegner heard his commander screaming at him. Wegner pulled on the trigger, unleashing thousands of bullets into Taylor Fellers and his lads from Virginia. Within minutes, virtually all of them were dead, including Taylor Fellers. All along Omaha Beach, 5 long miles of sand, a similar story was unfolding. Franz Gockel was still crouched behind his machine gun nest when the first Americans waded ashore on his stretch of beach. He and his mate, Joseph Schroeder, waited in silence, held their nerve, and then they let rip. There's carnage, bodies crumple in front of their eyes. Within minutes, the beach is strewn with American corpses. Those Americans, they're trapped in hell. There's machine gun fire, mortars exploding in the sand, landing craft blown to pieces, burning fuel, exploding ammunition, screams from the wounded. But among the dead and wounded, there were also the miraculous living. Men like Sergeant Jack Ellery, who's dodged the bullets, avoided the mortars, and made it to the sea wall where there's some sort of shelter. For the troops who survived the slaughter that was taking place on the beach just over there, this was the first point of refuge, the first place where they could take some sort of shelter from the machine guns being fired by Franz Gockel and his German comrades on the hillside up there. Now, Jack Ellery begins to rally the survivors, urges them to attack the Germans, because he knows, they all know, that the only hope of survival is to climb behind the German strongholds and attack them from the rear. Each of the 5 beach landings followed a similar pattern that morning, and on each beach, life or death was a game of chance. Among the best prepared troops were the British commandos led by the flamboyant Scottish aristocrat Lord Lovat. Those troops included Cliff Morris and his mates, who'd been sick for the entire Channel crossing. Now they were approaching the shore, and it was getting dangerous. They each took a shot of rum as the shells burst around them, and then the ramp went down. This is actually a picture that Cliff drew of himself, and his diary. It's a very rare, wonderfully vivid and also horrific account of just how terrible it was to land on the beaches of Normandy on the 6th of June 1944. He describes vividly the landing craft coming into shore, and as they approached the beach, the sustained German gunfire, the mortars, the shells, it's absolute hell, and they're just waiting for the moment when the ramp goes down and they have to charge up the beach. The commandos were not the first to land on Sword Beach. They'd been preceded by the East Yorks Regiment, and the East Yorks had been massacred by Hitler's defenders, who were in charge of making sure that the British did not land or get ashore on Sword Beach. It was shortly after 8 o'clock in the morning on the 6th of June when the commandos landed here on Sword Beach. Among them was Cliff Morris, who was terrified and he was exhausted. When the ramp went down, the sight that greeted him horrified him. There were dead and dying strewn over the beach. There were body parts, heads, limbs, legs, arms. Clifford Morris felt that he'd landed in hell. Lord Lovat had always said only the best trained men would survive. His men were certainly the best trained. They raced up Sword Beach in a hail of fire, storming the German strongholds and overwhelming their defences. Within minutes, they'd got the upper hand. The Germans were in trouble. There was one incongruous sight that morning. Lord Lovat had brought his personal bagpiper with him, Private Bill Millin. He now ordered him to march up and down the beach playing the bagpipes. Bill Millin did just that, earning himself a new nickname, the Mad Bastard.
Commando forces landed on Sword Beach, and Lord Lovat, being a Scotsman of course, he had with him his personal bagpiper, Bill Millin. who played on the beach and up to the bridge, and the veterans on the bridge have told me that they can recall hearing the pipes. And they were relieved because they knew the reinforcements were coming. Can I just say, as he led the troops up from the beach, he'd be about 200 yards in front of the rest of the men because, of course, he'd be giving their positions away. So the men kept as far away from him as possible. So he often found himself hundreds of yards in front of the rest of the brigade.
Even the Germans thought he was mad. They would later say they didn't shoot him because they thought he was Dummkopf, simple-minded. The commandos had triumphed at Sword Beach. By 9:30 in the morning, many German guns had been silenced and 7 of the 8 beach exits cleared. Now it was time for the dangerous march inland. Their next task was to relieve Major John Howard and his airborne troops who'd captured the 2 vital bridges during the night. No one yet knew if they were still alive.
General Eisenhower's order of the day was distributed to every man on board the invading armada. Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. You will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well trained, well equipped, and battle hardened. He will fight savagely.
The Allied beach landings had begun at 6:30 in the morning when the first American troops stormed ashore at Utah Beach. This was the most westerly of the 5 beaches and had to be attacked first on account of the tide. Now, 2 hours later, Allied troops were assaulting all 5 landing beaches. Along a 40-mile stretch of coast, Americans, British and Canadians, along with other Allied soldiers, were all fighting against the German defenders. This replica of the Atlantic Wall, built in 1943-1944, gives some idea of the formidable challenge that were facing the men coming ashore on the beaches of Normandy. Remember, they'd crossed the channel at night. They'd been violently seasick for much of the way. They'd come ashore under heavy, sustained German machine gun fire, and then they faced this massive block of concrete. And this wall had to be destroyed or somehow scaled if they were going to go on and liberate Nazi-occupied France. And this is why the D-Day planners put such energy into working out how on earth they could blow a hole in this wall to allow tanks and men to get through it. Every D-Day objective was dangerous for the Allies that morning, but some were more dangerous than others. One of the most perilous goals was at Pointe du Hoc, a towering clifftop close to Omaha Beach. Allied spy planes had picked up German guns so powerful they could hit both Utah Beach and Omaha Beach. If these guns fired on troops as they were landing, it would have devastating consequences. Destroying those guns was a specialist mission requiring a specialist team. For months, a young American lieutenant, James Rudder, had been training a band of US Rangers for this dangerous assault. Many were unruly misfits, tough, violent, unpredictable. Rudder knocked them into shape, turning them into an elite band of soldiers. They were to be pushed to the limit on D-Day. The big warships offshore bombarded the cliffs in advance of the Rangers' landing, as they had done along this whole stretch of coast. But the heavy seas meant that James Rudder's men arrived late at the Pointe du Hoc. By the time they were ready to scale the cliffs, the Germans were waiting for them. Using rope and grapnels, Rudder's men scaled the cliffs under heavy fire. It was a perilous undertaking, for they were constantly shot at. But they made it to the top, then poured gunfire into the German positions. To their dismay, they discovered that the German big guns, their objective, had been removed and hidden. They feared their mission had been in vain. But 2 of Rudder's men, Sergeants Leonard Lommel and Jacques Kahn, went in search of them, while the others flushed the Germans from their strongpoints. One of the American Rangers, Leonard Lommel, is convinced that the big German guns must be somewhere. Having fought his way across Pointe du Hoc, he comes to a sunken lane. He follows it and comes to some trees, and there, under the trees, are the big German guns. He's found them. He pulls out some thermite grenades that he's carrying, puts them into the gun's mechanism and sets the fuse. And within seconds, the mechanisms of these guns are entirely destroyed. The Germans have lost their big guns. Juno Beach, the Canadian beach, a 5-mile stretch with two of the largest towns in the middle, Courceuil and Bernières-sur-Mer. This made the landings particularly dangerous because it was easy for the Germans to defend a town where every house could be a defensive position. 14,000 Canadians took part in D-Day, all of them volunteers. 14,000 families who had a son taking part in the liberation of Normandy.
So Juno Beach extended 8 kilometers between the British landing sectors Gold and Sword, beginning in the west with the village of Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer and continuing through Bernières-sur-Mer, Courcelles-sur-Mer, and finishing in the east at Grey-sur-Mer. These were mostly fishing villages before the war, but under the German occupation, these villages were fortified as part of the Atlantic Wall. Juno Beach itself consisted in different beaches. Most of these beaches are flat and sandy, but there are some natural cliff faces and sea walls. So Juno Beach was very well fortified. Strong points formed the backbone of German defenses. The beaches were also littered by thousands of anti-tank and anti-infantry obstacles. Courcelles-sur-Mer was the most heavily defended area on Juno Beach, liberated by British and Canadian forces on D-Day. The reason is simple. There was, and there still is, a port in Courcelles-sur-Mer, so the entrance to the port was defended by two strong points.
Charles and Elliot Dalton were brothers, and both were landing on Juno Beach that morning. Their mother was terrified they might both be killed. Charles begged his commanding officer to spare Elliot the initial assault, but the officer refused. There's some rare and fascinating footage of Canadian troops going ashore at the coastal town of Bernières-sur-Mer. Unlike the Dalton brothers, these troops were not in the first wave, and nor were they under fire, which is why they could be filmed. But the footage manages to convey the terror of that split-second moment when the ramp goes down, the moment the men were exposed to the German machine gunners. It's easy to see why so many were killed in the first few seconds. Both Charles and Elliot Dalton faced the full fury of the German defences on that 5-mile stretch of Juno Beach. Charles Dalton's men came under sustained machine gun fire as they stormed ashore at the very place where this footage was shot later that morning. So many men were hit that the seawater frothed red with blood. Charles Dalton leapt ashore and ran towards an enemy pillbox. As he fired his Sten gun, a German bullet went through his helmet, skimming his scalp but missing his brain. He was seriously wounded. His brother Elliot had also come under heavy fire. On one of his landing craft, 28 out of the 35 men were gunned down on the beach. That's 80% dead or injured. Elliot Dalton and the survivors made it ashore and took out the German pillboxes one by one. Before long, this stretch of beach was in Allied hands, allowing thousands more troops to come ashore. Later that morning, Elliot was brought the terrible news that his brother Charles had died of his wounds. He was devastated and would fight with almost foolhardy courage for the next few days until he was badly wounded and sent back to England. When the nurse wheeled Elliot Dalton to a bed marked Major Dalton, she noticed a patient already lying there. She told the patient he was in the wrong bed, only to discover that it was indeed Major Dalton, Major Charles Dalton. Miraculously, both brothers were alive.
It took them about 3 hours to clear the beaches of obstacles. So the Canadians had landed with about 8,000 British engineers whose job it was to clear mines, barbed wire, and beach obstacles off of the beach. And at about noon, Major General Rodney Keller established his headquarters at Bernières-sur-Mer. So it took them about 3 hours to get off the beach. So after the Canadian soldiers and the British engineers cleared the beach of obstacles and the fortified towns of resistance, they began their advance inland. But of course the Germans, they'd established fortifications farther inland, their defense in depth, so it took them a little while to get farther inland. At the end of the first day of the Allied landings, Canadians had made it 12 kilometers inland, which is farther than any other Allied landing force, but it was still 8 kilometers short of their final objective of the Carpiquet aerodrome, which is found just next to Caen. As the Canadians made their way inland, they encountered stark resistance in towns that were fortified farther inland. And one of the major problems that faced the Canadians on June 6th was in fact that the port town of Courcelles was more heavily fortified than other towns along Juno Beach. And so in order to land all the reinforcements safely, they had to congest all of the reinforcements onto one beach, which was at Bernières-sur-Mer, and that created quite a significant traffic jam. And it forced a lot of the infantry and the tanks to remain in their vehicles instead of moving onto the beach and farther inland to help their comrades.
The Canadians on Juno Beach fought with skill and bravado. Once the beach was secure, thousands more troops came ashore. With them came jeeps, tanks, bulldozers and armoured vehicles. All along the coastline of Normandy, masses of military hardware was now being brought ashore.
So the Canadians suffered 574 casualties on D-Day, but of course that did not mark the end of the fighting. So in fact, there's a cemetery that's about 12 minutes away from Juno Beach, where 2,000 Canadians are buried. So you can imagine that 574 of those were casualties on the first day. Of 341 were dead at the end of the first day of the landings, but about 2,000 Canadians are buried in that cemetery. So that gives you a bit of a sense of how bloody the fighting was as they made their way inland towards their objectives.
But such displays of drive and determination were now occurring all along this stretch of coastline. Little by little, the Allies were overwhelming the defences of Field Marshal Rommel's Atlantic Wall. They were already sniffing at victory. One of the great successes that D-Day morning was the rapid advance of the British commandos from Sword Beach to Pegasus Bridge. The bridge had been captured shortly after midnight by John Howard and his men who'd landed by glider. They'd also seized a second vital bridge over the River Orne. And Trooper William Gladden was one of those men who was holding the bridges until reinforcements arrived from the D-Day beach landings.
I was Trooper William Gladden, all Armoured Corps and RTR Royal Tank Regiment, they were troopers. I was born 13th of January 1924. I joined the 6th Airborne in 1943. We were all young and it was so different then. You weren't scared. Even though you were going, there's a letter I wrote to my mother. I told her, I'm not scared, I'm just going to do something I've never done before in my life. Possibly take lives. And they'll be after taking my life, but nothing's going to happen to me.
The Orne Bridge, one of the two bridges which had to be captured intact, of course, is over there behind the high trees. And the glider landing zone for 2 of 3 gliders which should have landed here. One of them got lost and landed about 8 miles away. One of them landed in the field behind the electricity pylon, behind me, and one slightly further on, slightly further east. The high ground can be seen on the horizon, and that's where the airborne troops had to take up position, most of them. And can you see the gap in the trees? There's a large open space up there, large field, and that's where the 5th Parachute Brigade landed, about 2,000 men, 3 battalions, and the Germans had had poles put in the field. They were called Rommel's asparagus, and they were vertical poles, they were tree trunks, and they had to come down before the glider-borne troops came in later on the morning of the 6th of June.
We landed on D-Day, the 6th of June, but we had to come in the afternoon because the landing zone wasn't clear in the morning. It had all poles stuck in it, what the Germans had put there. So the 22nd Independent Parachute Battalion, who were with us at Lark Hill, they went in first, blew out the poles, and then we came in. we landed in the glider just beyond the church in Ronville. And that's where we got out the glider. After the tankers came out of the glider, we got our bikes out and went to the Orme Bridge and dug in there for the first night. We had to dig in case the Germans tried to take that bridge back. And that bridge, Pegasus Bridge and the Orme Bridge, if they hadn't been kept in our hands, they would have never got off the beach.
The glider-borne troops from the Oxenbucks had taken the bridges, and they had to hold on for about 90 minutes. And at 1 o'clock in the morning, one of the parachute battalions, the 7th, landed, about 600 men, and some of them, because they were scattered, some of them were down on the bridge by 2 o'clock in the morning. And Howard's men, the men in the gliders, were put in reserve between the two bridges, and the parachute battalion, the 7th, had to hold the town of Benoville. They weren't too concerned about the eastern side of the bridges, because 12,000 airborne troops were landing. It was the western side, where there were no troops until the landings on the beaches 7 hours later. And there was very, very heavy fighting in the town of Benoville on the western side of the Caen Canal.
The idea in getting our tanks over there behind their lines was to make them think, hello, they've got armour inland. But they were handy because quite a few parachutists were still holed up in the hedgerows, and as soon as they moved, the German snipers had a go at them. So with our tank with the 2-pounder, we could blast them out and release the parachutists from the hedgerows. We just done what we had to do. We were in the army, and we were given a job to do. We just, as I've always done, if ever I'm given a job, civvy street or not, I'll just do my best.
While Bill Gladden was just doing his best, the British commandos were trying to reach him and his fellow comrades. Among the toughest of all was Private Stan Scotty Scott, whose flattened nose made him look like a street fighter. Now he gathered a band of men from No. 3 Troop and led a fighting advance to the bridges. They went by bike, they'd trained for this in England, but it was a ride from hell, which involved flushing Germans from hidden defences. Their final approach was extremely dangerous, for there were Germans everywhere, as Stan Scotty Scott would later recall. Rounds hitting from all sides, ricocheting off and splatting and hitting. Campbell got clobbered, hit through the neck, fell down in one big lump. But they made it. It was a moment of triumph, both for the commandos and for John Howard's men. And there would be even more scenes of triumph when Lord Lovett arrived with his bagpiper, still alive, still playing his music. The 2 vital bridges were now secure. The Germans had been blocked from launching a counter-offensive against the beachhead at Sword, and the Allied troops could now advance deeper into Normandy. At the eastern end of the landings, everything was going according to plan. Not all the soldiers had been as successful as the commandos. On Omaha Beach, the Americans were in serious trouble. The terrain was one problem. Directly behind Omaha Beach were sheer cliffs, almost impossible to climb. But a far greater problem was the hundreds of machine gun nests causing absolute slaughter on the beach. By mid-morning, things were going so badly that General Omar Bradley, watching from an American battleship, considered abandoning Omaha and redirecting his men to the other beaches. But 2 important events were to save the day. One was the decision to swing all the American naval guns towards Omaha Beach. Within minutes, the German strongpoints were being pounded by huge shells. This took out the Germans' most dangerous positions. The second important decision was to send in 2 highly experienced commanders, General Norman Cotter and Colonel Charles Canham. They landed on the beach and teamed up with the newly landed Rangers, who began an all-guns-blazing assault on Omaha. Slowly, the battle began to turn. Franz Gockel was still in his machine gun nest, still hiding out. but he was now coming under direct fire. The whole of his strongpoint was under attack. DOCKUR was alarmed to see American soldiers behind his strongpoint. This spelled real danger. He was about to flee when an American grenade exploded near him, sending shrapnel deep into his hand. He would survive, but for him, D-Day was over. The assault on Omaha Beach had been bloody. By the end of the afternoon, when the beach was finally secured, the Americans had suffered 2,400 casualties. But men were now landing in huge numbers. 34,000 troops would land here by the end of the day. Field Marshal Rommel had long argued that if the Allies were to be defeated on D-Day, then they needed to be attacked immediately with all the force at his disposal, including his highly trained mechanized panzer divisions. But Hitler had disagreed. He wanted them held in reserve. It was many hours before they got the orders to launch a counterattack. One of Rommel's most experienced panzer commanders was Colonel Hermann von Oppeln-Bronickowski. He was a Prussian aristocrat who'd fought with great skill on the Eastern Front. Now he was ordered into battle and told to kick the British back into the sea. But this was easier said than done. Roads were impassable, bridges had been blown up, important junctions were in Allied hands. Not until 5 p.m. did the Panzer Colonel get his tanks onto high ground near the villages of Breville and Perrières. What those tank commanders didn't realise was that the British were watching them and waiting with their anti-tank guns. As the mighty panzers advanced, they came under a bruising assault from the British. Tanks were blown apart, some exploded, some caught fire. The great German panzer counteroffensive was stopped in its tracks. Colonel von Oppeln-Bronickowski could scarcely believe it. "I never thought I'd see the day this would happen," he said. "I knew then that the war was really finished." The German colonel was not alone in thinking the war had been lost on D-Day. By the evening of D-Day, thousands of tanks, armoured vehicles and big guns were being brought ashore, along with tens of thousands of men. Gliders, too, were bringing in vast numbers of troops, along with a huge array of military hardware. Field Marshal Rommel did not arrive back from Germany until 9:15 that evening. Just a few months earlier, he told his adjutant, Helmut Lang, "If we don't throw them back into the sea within the first 24 hours, we are lost. When this happens, the day will be the longest day, and perhaps the final day." The war, of course, did not end with D-Day. Almost 6 weeks of intense fighting would take place before the Allies broke out of Normandy. And there were to be 335 days of fighting before Germany's unconditional surrender on the 7th of May, 1945. But D-Day had made victory possible at the cost of 4,414 Allied lives. By the end of June, 3 weeks after the landings, a staggering 850,000 men had been landed, along with 148,000 vehicles. It really was the beginning of the end. In the aftermath of those historic beach landings, American war correspondent Ernie Pyle walked along Omaha Beach. He found the experience profoundly moving. Submerged tanks and overturned boats and burned trucks and shell-shattered jeeps. Now that it is over, it seems to me a pure miracle that we ever took the beach at all. As I ploughed out over the wet sand of the beach on that first day ashore, I walked around what seemed to be a couple of pieces of driftwood sticking out of the sand. But they weren't driftwood. They were a soldier's 2 feet. He was completely covered by the shifting sands, except for his feet. The toes of his GI shoes pointed toward the land he'd come so far to see, and which he saw so briefly.
for we're saying goodbye to them all. As into our glider we crawl. We're unlucky fellas, we've got no propellers, so cheer up my lads, we're airborne.